There seems to be a pretty big divide in the trans femme community between the radically queer trans femmes and the dolls. But the thing is, both sides of this divide are radically queer, just in different ways. As someone who floats between the messy nightlife transsexual spaces and the terminally online trans femme gamer spaces, honestly, the majority of us are awesome. The majority of us rock. There's a few bad apples from each space that give the rest of the space a bad name. But like, if you're a doll and you like putting hours and hours into your appearance every day, same. But that doesn't mean that girls who don't do that are any less valid than us. And if you're a trans man who never wears makeup, that's awesome, good for you. But that doesn't mean that the girls who like to look and feel pretty and want all the surgeries, etc. are somehow bad. I mean, look, the reality is the government is trying to make our existence illegal. And we're all in this together. There's absolutely no reason to sit here and hate on another trans woman because of preconceived notions about them. Period. And if you're not a trans woman, you don't get to hate on us at all, sorry. I just think our community is so much stronger when we're unified and we're together. So ultimately, if you're one of the girls, I support you, period. As long as you respect my boundaries and don't put other girls down, I love you. Like a sister.
All right. So I thought this was a hilarious video just because it illustrates something that's so ironic in the trans community, which is that they talk a big game about how Ray Blanchard is a transphobic and terrible person because he had the audacity to observe that, generally speaking, there are two different types of trans women as articulated in the video by this trans activist, which is, the radically queer trans femmes versus the dolls, the transsexual nightlife versus the terminally online gamer trans lesbians or whatever. And Ray Blanchard noticed this. Like, he was doing clinical intake in for like a gender clinic. He was sort of doing the assessments for whether these medical treatments were appropriate, and he just happened to notice that there seem to be two different types of trans women. And people always say, like, Ray Blanchard, like, it's so reductive to say that there's only two types. You're saying that this entire class of trans women can be clumped into, just two categories. That's too simplistic. People are complicated and blah, blah, blah. But like, regardless of any exceptions to the general pattern, even within the trans communities, you will constantly see this pattern being recognized. Like, everyone knows that there's a difference between this sort of like these doll transsexuals, the nightlife transsexuals who are into men and very effeminate and very passable, and have been very effeminate, young effeminate homosexual males from like a young age. Sorry, my cat. And versus this more terminally online, autistic, nerdy, trans woman who's into women, that sort of archetype, the more computer programmer archetype of the trans woman. Everyone knows that that's an archetype. So we have these two different archetypes. And I always hear people say, like, it's just not realistic that there would only be two types of, trans women. That's too simplistic to put people into two boxes. But it's it's to me, it's not that surprising. Like, to me, it's not like there's some principle in the universe, some principle in nature that says there can never be a population that falls into two distinct clusters. I mean, that's a little weird if you think about it, to say that, like, oh, there's something theoretically suspicious about falling into two clusters along some particular dimension that you're analyzing. That's not that surprising. Like, you would actually expect that a sort of two type cluster would pop up in nature all the time. Like, that's not that surprising. I mean, I can't necessarily think of any example off the top of my head, but I'm sure if I went digging, I could find different typologies. Because what is a typology? A typology is a way of organizing your empirical observations of the world. You go out into the world, you go out into nature, and you observe things. Your sort of natural pattern recognition faculties in your mind kick in, and you just sort of notice patterns in the world. This is the sort of like foundational layer of almost all psychology, particularly in the animal world. You're doing animal psychology, animal behaviorism, you're studying animals. A lot of it starts off with observation of behavior in the wild. It's called naturalistic observation. That's a foundational piece, and then you can conduct more rigorous testing, more experimental controlling, but naturalistic observation and just sort of categorizing. It's like what Darwin was doing when he was out collecting all the specimens on his, the voyage of the Beagle. It's naturalistic observation, collecting facts, observing things, and then you sort of see patterns in nature. There's patterns in nature. So why would we expect that there's not a pattern in the population of trans women? And you see that there's even, the trans women themselves comment and notice this distinction. And this is all Blanchardian typology is. And so to paint it as some like evil, terrible, transphobic, bigoted, discriminatory, theory that like, pathologizes or stigmatizes, I mean, no, that's not really what's going on at all. It's just noticing that there's two different types. And then Ray Blanchard, being a scientific observer, he noticed that, well, what is the underlying basis of the two types? Like, where do the two types come from? Like, are there distinct causal pathways that lead to these distinct clusters or patterns? Like, why are there two patterns? Like where does that come from? Well, he noticed in the data in his clinical intake that the cluster can be defined, or these two patterns generally track your sexual orientation. So whether you are exclusively into men as a homosexual, and this is the sort of like, so when you imagine this type of homosexual, like you have to imagine like this sort of classic archetype for this is like the lady boys of Thailand. These are very effeminate, you know, homosexual males who sort of take on, they're sort of like naturally very effeminate, like in their appearance. Like they're just like they're more neotenous as individuals. Like they're more naturally feminine as males. Like even without any hormones or surgeries or anything, like they're usually smaller, more petite, they're more feminine. There's a sort of like natural yeah, it's like a part of the population. I think it's like a distinct like type of human. I don't know. I don't know how to describe it, but I think there's sort of like in human nature, you sort of see this um for lack of a better term, third gender type expression or like phenotype in this young gay community. And like it's in that population that is this are the lady boys of like Thailand, and that sort of like classically homosexual effeminate male living in this cultural role, like often involved in like sex work and stuff like this, like survival prostitution. That's very common. Being in the entertainment business, the beauty business, stuff like this. So that's all very common for this, I think, phenotype. And the other phenotype is like, the asexuals, the bisexuals, and the heterosexual trans women. So Ray Blanchard just noticed that, and yet he's been demonized as this like terrible person. And they're constantly saying that, like, oh well, you know, autogynephilia has no scientific basis. It's all bullshit. It's like the scientific basis is fundamentally based on empirical observation of reality, and people who have spent enough time in these communities of trans women, everyone with eyeballs can notice this distinction. And does the typology fundamentally depend on saying that, well, there's only two clusters. There's only two clusters and no possible third cluster. No, that's not actually um, what the theory says at all. Which is one of the most common criticisms of the theory, which is that, well, I don't fall into that pattern. That typology doesn't describe me. You'll often hear trans women say that they don't fall into the clusters. It's like, oh, these two clusters, these two patterns, that doesn't fit into my experience. That doesn't match my life. And a lot of the times, I'm skeptical of these responses because I think one, it's a kind of there's common a scripted response. Um, it's sort of just like a default political knee jerk reaction to reject the typology. And so I think there's an unconscious motivation to like not recognize yourself in the cluster patterns. And also there's like a misunderstanding, I think, of the asexual AGP phenotype, which is, I think, not commonly understood. So people who don't have super overtly sexual, masturbatory erotic lies, they might think that they don't fall into the AGP classification when there is a whole part of the theory of AGP that there can be an asexual phenotype that doesn't take on this overtly fetishistic behavior that's with the high libido you typically see in AGP. But um, yeah, anyway, I just thought this video was like interesting, and I just wanted to like respond to it because like I don't know these trans activists like I think they're going to lose this battle because people notice things like and you can't stop that. And there's more and more information coming out about this. More and more people are talking about this. Like this Blanchardian typology is becoming more and more mainstream because it tracks onto reality. It tracks onto empirical observation. If even the trans activists are noticing this distinction, this pattern, then other people are definitely going to notice that pattern and they're going to talk about it and they're going to comment on it. And all Blanchardian typology is doing is trying to say, hey, what's the explanation for this distinction? The like Blanchardian thesis is that the explanation boils down to differences in sexuality. Now that's not saying that like you can reduce the entirety of transgenderism to sexuality. Like obviously there's more involved, just like it's like trying to reduce the entirety of like a gay man's life to just what he does in the bedroom. But obviously being a gay man impacts many aspects of his life, his thoughts, his feelings, his desires, his identity. His sexuality impacts many aspects of his life that go far beyond just the explicit sexual stuff. And that's same for heterosexuality too. It's like there's all this like courtship behavior and romantic behavior, and a lot of our activities are driven by our sexual desires. I mean, at an unconscious level, like most of the activities that are happening in civilization on a day-to-day basis are fundamentally driven by our unconscious desire, our drives to seek out mates. I mean, it doesn't feel like it consciously and like our consciously understood motivations, but unconsciously, like, when we are seeking out a career or engaging in creative acts, like a lot of that is like, part of these unconscious drives to like do things that we think will impress someone that we want to date. So, and this is why Freud, I think, was right that almost all of mental energy is ultimately sexual energy. Like we're all driven, we have these drives, um and all animals are driven by their sexuality, which is the evolutionary drive to have sex. I mean, that's such a core part of like what an animal is and what they're all about, particularly mammals, particularly apes, and particularly humans. I mean, it's just like it's weird to me that people say like, oh, like you're saying that like, you know, transsexuality is like, you know, all about sexuality. Well, so what? Like a lot of human behavior, a lot of human psychology is sexual in nature. Like all this mental energy that we spend, you know, like it's often a sublimination um of these sexual energies. You know, that's like almost all of civilization. And we sort of like, yeah, anyway, I'm going off track, definitely. But all right. I think that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.